You will learn to eat rocks. Those were the cruel final words a wealthy ranch owner shouted at a 74-year-old woman as he threw her out of her home just hours after her husband's funeral. He thought he was condemning her to death by banishing her to a worthless, storm-battered hillside, but he made a fatal mistake. He didn't know that the terrible storm he hoped would destroy her was actually nature's way of revealing a secret buried for millions of years. A secret worth a fortune that was lying right beneath the mud. How did a forgotten widow turn a curse into a multi-million-dollar blessing and bring a tyrant to his knees? You have to see this to believe it. It is such a joy to have you here with us today. Please, take a moment to leave a comment and let me know which part of the world you are watching from. I love reading your messages. Now, let's get started. Dorothy moved slowly along the dusty path of the small rural cemetery, the freezing morning wind piercing right through to her bones. Beside her walked her son, Nicholas. His face was hardened by an unbearable mix of sadness, exhaustion, and a silent fear that squeezed his chest like an invisible fist. Dorothy, wrapped in a black dress she hadn't worn since her own mother's burial decades ago, felt the deep unfairness of life. At 74 years old, she never imagined she would have to bury the man with whom she had shared every sunrise for more than half a century. She barely murmured, "Now, what will become of us?" And she said it with that fragility that appears when the soul is left defenseless. And Nicholas replied, saying that they would see how to move forward, although deep in his voice, it was perceived that he himself didn't know where to start. When they finally lowered the casket, Dorothy felt something inside her also descend into the darkness, a kind of emotional vertigo that forced her to rest a hand on her son's shoulder so as not to lose her balance. And for a few minutes, the two remained observing as the dirt fell onto the box with a dull and definitive sound that resonated like a brutal closure to the only security they had in life. Harold. After saying goodbye with a final prayer pronounced almost in a whisper, they began the walk back to the ranch's bunkhouse, where they had lived for so many years that Dorothy could no longer remember a different home. Each step they took seemed to weigh more than the last, and although the path was short, the walk became a slow journey, loaded with memories that seemed to cling to the air and follow them like a melancholic shadow. And when they finally reached the weathered wooden door of their house, the sensation that enveloped them was not relief, but absolute emptiness, because everything there smelled of Harold. The chair where he drank coffee at dawn, the blanket he used when it was cold, the hat hanging on the wall. Dorothy said, "This is no longer a home without him." And Nicholas replied saying they would have to be strong, that Harold would have wanted to see them remain united and fighting. But even while he spoke, his gaze wandered over the walls as if looking for an answer that didn't come. They didn't have time to settle into the painful silence, because just a few minutes later, they heard the roar of a powerful engine approaching, kicking up dust in the air. A luxury truck, one of those only seen in the hands of those who think money gives them the right to everything, stopped in front of the little house, and from it descended Patrick, the owner of the ranch, a man of about 60 with a clean-shaven face, a perfectly starched shirt, and an arrogance so solid it seemed to walk ahead of him like an authoritarian shadow, without expressing any condolences, without even looking at the mourning clothes they both wore. "I'm here to remind you that this house isn't yours," Patrick announced coldly. "It was part of the payment for Harold's work. Now that he's gone, your occupancy rights are finished." Indignant, Nicholas stepped forward. "You could at least give us a few days to gather our things." "I'm not here to negotiate," Patrick shot back. "I'm here to inform you. You need to vacate immediately." Dorothy, without raising her voice but with a firmness born of fresh pain, looked him in the eye. "We have nowhere to go, Patrick." Patrick smiled, a cruel gesture of a man enjoying his power. "I'm a generous man, Dorothy. I won't leave you on the street. I'm giving you the deed to Stony Creek." He paused, his tone mocking. "You can start from zero there if you feel like working, located on a forgotten hillside where not even grass grew," and with a mocking tone added that there they could start from zero if they felt like working, although by the ironic expression in his eyes, it was evident he said it expecting to see them fail. Patrick extended a crumpled paper, the supposed deed to that worthless plot, and Nicholas wanted to protest saying that was a mockery, but Dorothy silenced him by gently resting a hand on his arm, understanding that arguing would serve no purpose because they were at the mercy of the man who had kept them tied to the ranch their entire lives. Patrick insisted, saying that was more than many had, that they should feel grateful. And before turning to go back to his truck, he added another phrase that fell like slow poison. "You will learn to eat rocks, because in Stony Creek there is nothing else." It is heartbreaking to witness such cruelty, especially when Dorothy is already grieving. Patrick thinks he has just sentenced her to misery, but he has no idea that his arrogance is actually setting the stage for a miracle. "Stay with me, because karma works in mysterious ways." Once the man got into the vehicle and drove off, raising a cloud of dust, Dorothy remained standing in the entrance of the little house, holding the deed to Stony Creek with trembling hands, while her son breathed heavily, trying to contain his anger. And in that instant, she felt that the weight of the humiliation was as great as that of the newborn grief for Harold's death. However, she also understood that they had no other path, and that dignity sometimes consists simply of keeping walking, even when life hits without mercy. So she said they would leave, that they would ask nothing more of anyone, that this land would be their next station, and that although Patrick had wanted to condemn them, they would find a way to survive. Nicholas lowered his gaze, accepting his mother's decision, and together they began to gather their few belongings while Dorothy clutched the deed to Stony Creek against her chest, remembering the rancher's cruel phrase and feeling that although life had snatched much from them, it hadn't yet managed to break her completely. And with that mixture of sadness and determination, she closed the door for the last time, prepared to face the destiny awaiting her on the other side of the dust of the road. Dorothy advanced slowly along the dusty road leading toward the hillside of Stony Creek, while the afternoon sun beat down with an intensity that seemed to take special aim at her and at Nicholas, her adult son, who carried on their backs the few objects they had been able to rescue before abandoning the ranch house. And every step they took raised small clouds of dust that clung to the black clothes they still wore from Harold's funeral, as if even the mourning refused to disappear completely. The trail was long, winding, steep, and almost no one from the town dared to look them in the face, for everyone knew that Patrick had ordered that no one help them under any circumstances. And although some older women peeked their heads out of windows, their faces showed a fear that surpassed any intention of compassion. So Dorothy understood that this last journey had to be traveled solely by the two of them, in silence, and with a bitter mix of pain and resignation. While Nicholas, panting from the weight of the luggage, said it was incredible how people could erase a friendship of years just because a rich man raised his voice. To which Dorothy replied, saying they shouldn't harbor hate, that in times of misery everyone protected their own skin as best they could, although her eyes, loaded with fatigue, revealed that the betrayal of those who used to greet them with a cordial smile hurt her much more than she admitted. As they advanced, the vegetation began to disappear, giving way to dry and hard terrain, where the wind hit with more force and the sky stretched wide and bright, like an immense canvas presaging some imminent change. When they finally reached the high part of the road, the two stopped for a moment because the view that opened before them had something desolate about it, and Dorothy brought a hand to her chest, feeling her heart squeeze upon observing the famous Stony Creek, a plot that was nothing more than a huge sloping hillside covered in black rocks, thorns, rough earth, and deep cracks that snaked like ancient wounds. And Nicholas exhaled a sigh loaded with frustration while saying that this wasn't land but punishment, that Patrick had achieved his goal by sending them to a place where not even goats would survive. But Dorothy replied, saying they had to remain firm and that she wouldn't allow the rancher to see them defeated, although the words barely managed to hide the sadness overwhelming her upon realizing that this parcel was not an inheritance, but refuse disguised as generosity. The wind blew with such force that it kicked up swirls of dust that hit their legs and obscured their vision. And even so, Dorothy advanced to an area where large rocks formed a kind of natural hollow, a reduced space, but sufficient for a small shelter to fit. And while she observed the terrain carefully, she felt tears fighting to come out. But she held them back because she said she wasn't going to cry in front of Nicholas, not when he needed her whole, and added, saying that there, in that piece of hostile world, they would build their castle, although her voice broke slightly upon pronouncing such a metaphor, knowing they had no tools, nor lumber, nor anything to facilitate that purpose. But she also knew that if she didn't speak those words, hopelessness would drag them both down. Nicholas looked at her surprised, perhaps already prepared to see her crumble, but seeing her lift her chin and dig her feet into the earth, he understood that his mother wasn't willing to give up and said he would do everything possible to turn that place into a dignified home. Although in his gaze, the restlessness of one who fears destiny is playing against them could still be perceived. Together, they began to unload the bags, and Dorothy opened one of them, taking out the tarp they had brought. A piece of durable fabric, but worn by the years, and indicated to Nicholas to help her spread it between two large rocks that served as natural support, while she held down the corners with flat stones she found on the ground. And although the task seemed simple, the wind lashed without rest, making every movement difficult and forcing Dorothy to repeat several times that they had to hurry because the sky was changing with unsettling speed. The firmament, which hours before looked clear, began to cover itself with dense, heavy, dark clouds creeping from the horizon like gigantic moving shadows. And Dorothy observed that change with a bitter sensation of premonition, as if nature was preparing to test them immediately. Something she confirmed, noting how the air became colder, how the sunlight faded ahead of time, and how the silence of the surroundings acquired a tense, deep, almost electric quality. Nicholas commented, saying it looked like a storm was approaching, that maybe they should look for a safer spot. But Dorothy replied, saying there was no safer spot on that terrain, that improvised shelter had to be enough for now, and that they couldn't lose time looking for something better, because the storm, whatever it was already on its way, and they wouldn't have the chance to reorganize once it started. While they fixed the tarp with more stones and adjusted the edges to prevent the wind from ripping it away, Dorothy thought that although she was trying to maintain the illusion for her son, the truth was that the landscape had nothing of adventure or hope. It was an arid and cruel wasteland, a place where loneliness was felt in the bones and where any attempt to prosper seemed condemned beforehand. But still, she forced herself to say out loud that this would be their new beginning, and she said it because she knew that, without words of encouragement, the internal darkness would devour them before the external storm. Finally, when the tarp remained extended between the rocks, forming a kind of improvised roof, Dorothy sat for a moment on a large stone to catch her breath, while the cold breeze swirled her gray hair around her face. And in that instant, she understood that Patrick hadn't just taken their house, but had also tried to steal their dignity. But she also understood that dignity is something only lost when one abandons it oneself, and she didn't plan to do so. The sky rumbled with a first distant thunderclap announcing the imminent start of the tempest, and Dorothy, watching the blackened horizon, felt that sound was like a dark call, warning that the tests about to come would be hard, perhaps harder than she could imagine. But still, she said they would resist, that this terrain wouldn't destroy them, because something deep in her being told her that even in the most difficult lands a purpose could be hiding, though it still had no shape or name. As the wind intensified, Dorothy and Nicholas took refuge under the tarp, listening to the growing murmur of the storm, approaching like a monster of clouds and lightning. And it was at that moment, just before the first frozen drops began to fall, when Dorothy felt her destiny was changing, though she didn't know if for good or bad, and her image, with the deed to Stony Creek in her hands and her gaze fixed on the fury-laden sky, remained engraved as a symbol of silent resistance in the middle of the desert of stones she now had to call home. The sky began to transform in a disturbing way, while Dorothy and Nicholas tried to settle under the taut tarp they had raised between two rocks. And suddenly the wind, that until a few minutes ago blew with fury, stopped abruptly, as if the mountain had held its breath, generating a strange silence that made Dorothy sit up immediately with the presentiment that something grave was about to unleash. And Nicholas, looking toward the horizon, said he didn't like that silence because it seemed the anteroom to a misfortune. And he barely managed to pronounce those words when a gigantic lightning bolt illuminated the entire hillside, tearing violent flashes off the black stones, followed by thunder that made the ground vibrate beneath their feet, as if the earth itself were protesting. And then the first wave of rain fell with such intensity that the tarp trembled like living skin under the impact of the freezing water mixed with hail the size of walnuts. And Dorothy, clenching her teeth, said they had to hold on, that the storm would pass quickly, but her voice was lost amidst the roar of the sky, which seemed to be splitting in pieces. The wind picked up again, this time multiplied in strength, hitting the sides of the improvised shelter until the tarp began to bend inward, as if being sucked upward. And Nicholas, trying to hold down one of the stones he had placed on the corners, said the fastening was giving way, that they needed to reinforce it. but before he could move, a second lightning bolt struck so close they both felt the electricity run through the air, and instantly, a brutal gust ripped the tarp clean off, lifting it like a black bird struggling against savage winds before disappearing into the darkness. The roar of stones rolling downhill joined the noise of the water descending in an avalanche, turning the shelter into ruins in a matter of seconds. And Dorothy, seeing the rain hitting them directly without compassion, said to crouch next to the largest rock to protect themselves. But the wind kept pushing them, as if wanting to rip them off the mountain, and the ground, transformed into slippery mud, gave way with every step, forcing them to fight not to fall. Nicholas tried to cover his mother with his own body, but Dorothy pushed him down, saying she wouldn't allow him to be exposed, that she still had strength to resist, and she threw herself over him, pressing him against the rocky ground, while the hail fell with violence on her back and shoulders, and every impact hurt, as if small, sharp stones were hitting her again and again. But she didn't move an inch, and she felt her body go numb from the cold, soaking her clothes and getting into her bones. And Nicholas, shuddering, said he was cold, that he couldn't feel his legs, and Dorothy replied, saying to hold on, that she wouldn't let him fall. But inside she knew hypothermia was advancing, that the storm had no mercy, and that every second passing there was a direct fight against death. This is the moment where most people would simply give up. It feels like the world is trying to break Dorothy completely, but sometimes life has to strip everything away to reveal what is truly hidden beneath the surface. You won't believe what the morning brings. The night became a black mass, only interrupted by lightning bolts, revealing for instance the magnitude of the disaster. Rocks rolling, bushes torn up by the roots, torrents of water dragging earth and debris downhill, and Dorothy could feel her breathing becoming irregular, heavy, while the mud rose to her knees, sticking to her clothes and pulling at her as if wanting to sink her into some invisible pit. Nicholas shook uncontrollably, and his voice broke when he said he feared they wouldn't make it out of that night. But Dorothy replied, saying not to say that as long as she breathed, nothing would happen to them. Although she knew that promise was made more of faith than real strength. The storm seemed eternal, every minute fiercer than the last, and Dorothy felt the world reduced to the weight of her own body, protecting her son, to the unbearable cold biting her skin, to the deafening noise of the wind, taking with it pieces of earth and chunks of their shelter, and to the deep fear she tried to hide so Nicholas wouldn't crumble. There was a moment she thought she lost consciousness when the freezing water hit her face and darkness enveloped her completely. But an especially loud thunderclap made her open her eyes, reminding her she had to keep going, and she said barely in a whisper to resist a little more, that sunrise had to arrive. And finally, after what seemed an unending night, the lightning began to space out, the thunder moved away slowly, and the rain turned into a tired murmur, hitting the earth irregularly. And when the first gray clarity of dawn insinuated itself between the clouds, Dorothy lifted her head with difficulty, feeling her body ache in every muscle, and what she saw left her speechless. Stony Creek had been completely razed, and where before there were mounds of stones, bags, utensils, and their few belongings, now there was only mud, bare rocks, and deep furrows the storm had opened like scars on the mountain. The tarp had disappeared, the food was lost, the extra clothes had been dragged downhill, and Nicholas, slowly sitting up, said there was nothing left, that the storm had taken it all. And Dorothy felt a bitter pang in her chest, a mix of shame, vulnerability, and a devastating feeling of abandonment, as if the mountain itself was telling them it didn't want them there. However, even amidst that desolation, Dorothy took a deep breath, rested a hand on the wet rock to stay standing, and said they survived, that the mountain hadn't been able to take them, that they were still alive. And while the cold wind of dawn blew over their exhausted bodies, she understood that that night which almost killed them wasn't the end, but the start of something she still couldn't grasp, but that pushed her to keep going despite the pain, despite the loss, despite the brutality with which life had hit them. The morning mist clung to the hillside of Stony Creek like a gray, wet blanket, while Dorothy, still shivering from the cold of the storm that had almost killed them, stood next to the large rock where she and Nicholas had taken refuge during the night, and the panorama stretching before them was so desolate it seemed, more than a sunrise, the silent echo of some ancient disaster. Both their clothes were still soaked, The mud covered their legs almost to their knees, and Dorothy felt how the trembling of her body didn't come only from the cold, but also from the physical and emotional exhaustion that had left her on the verge of collapse. When suddenly, amidst the shreds of mist moving slowly under the first light of day, emerged the hunched figure of a man walking with a firm step, though visible fatigue. A man wrapped in a thick poncho and surprisingly dry, with boots squelching in the mud, as if accustomed to traversing these types of paths. And Nicholas, seeing him, said he didn't know who it was, but he seemed to be coming directly toward them, which made Dorothy tense up for an instant out of pure caution, although her expression, hardened by the previous night, softened slightly as soon as she saw the stranger raise a hand in a sign of peace. The man stopped a few steps from them and said his name was Walter, that he lived further up in the old part of the mountain, in a small cabin he had built himself years ago, and that he had come down as soon as the storm abated because the wind had carried a strange noise to his hut, as if something had detached downhill, and he wanted to make sure no one had been hurt. His voice was raspy but calm, and observing Dorothy and Nicholas, soaked, covered in mud, and with exhausted gazes, he asked if they had spent the night there. And when Dorothy replied saying yes, that they had endured the storm with no shelter other than a tarp the rain itself had carried away, Walter shook his head slowly and said the mountain is hard, but seldom shows itself so cruel. And he approached without waiting for permission and extended his poncho over Nicholas's shoulders, covering him with a gesture of surprising tenderness for someone who seemed to live so isolated. Nicholas tried to protest, saying he was fine, that it was his mother who needed the warmth, but Walter replied saying first one must prevent the most exhausted from losing body heat, and that Dorothy had an internal fire keeping her standing, even if he could see it fading slowly in the dim shine of her eyes. And then he rummaged through the folds of his worn leather satchel and took out 2 biscuits wrapped in dry paper and a piece of jerky, saying it wasn't much, but enough to prevent the cold from finishing beating them. Dorothy, who hadn't tasted a bite since the previous day, felt the simple smell of the food awaken a ferocious hunger in her. But even so, she said Nicholas should eat first, because he had borne the weight of the mud and the force of the storm, trying to protect her. To which Walter replied saying there was no first or after there, that when the mountain hits someone, it also hits the one beside them, so they should eat together. And so, under the mist that began to lift, they shared that humble breakfast which, strangely enough, tasted like hope. While they ate, Dorothy observed the old man carefully, noting his white beard was messy and his face furrowed with deep wrinkles. And yet, there was a serenity in his expression, a kind of ancient wisdom that seemed to come not from books or school, but from direct experience with the earth and its mysteries. And it was then when Walter, looking toward the raised hillside, said the storm of the previous night had been so brutal it had changed the shape of the mountain, that when rain falls with fury, it steals nothing, only cleans what shouldn't be there anymore. And Dorothy frowned slightly because she didn't understand how he could say something like that after having lost all their belongings, and asked what he meant by the rain cleaning. And Walter replied, saying he didn't refer to the cleaning that makes objects disappear, but the cleaning that leaves exposed what the earth had been hiding for a long time, as if the mountain had its own way of revealing its truth when men insist on ignoring it. Nicholas looked around and said he only saw desolation, rocks, mud, and destruction. But Walter replied saying, sometimes what looks like destruction is just preparation, and that the earth speaks in many ways, though most people don't know how to listen to it. And he added that the hillside had changed in a suspiciously significant way, as if the storm had unearthed something that previously remained hidden. Dorothy, still skeptical, asked what could be there that mattered if Patrick had mocked them precisely for considering that land useless. And Walter, with eyes fixed on the churned earth, said the curse of this hillside was never in the land, but in the eyes of those who looked at it without understanding it, because men like Patrick believe themselves owners of the truth just because they have money and power, but in reality, they don't know how to distinguish between a piece of stone and a treasure, between sterile ground and a spot full of possibilities. Dorothy felt a shudder that had nothing to do with the cold, as if something in those words anchored a new idea in her mind, though she replied saying all that sounded very pretty, but the only thing she saw was a place that had been about to kill them, a place where they didn't even have the certainty of being able to survive. And Walter smiled with a mix of patience and sadness, saying the mountain never kills just because. that what almost killed them was the storm, not the earth, and that land, if they knew how to see it with other eyes, perhaps had something to offer them, though he didn't dare assure it without observing better. The sun began to filter through the gray clouds, projecting a pale light on the hillside, and something in the way the rays illuminated the wet stones made Dorothy feel for the first time since the previous night a slight vibration of curiosity, a minimal but persistent spark, telling her that maybe, just maybe, the storm had been more than a misfortune, because if a stranger who owed them nothing had shown up in the mist to offer bread, shelter, and words that seemed to come from a deeper place than simple compassion, wasn't it possible the earth also had something reserved for them? Nicholas, still shivering, rested a hand on his mother's shoulder and said they should listen to the old man, that after all, he seemed to know the mountain better than anyone. And Walter, looking at both with that strange calm characterizing him, said he didn't intend to convince them of anything, that time and the earth itself would be the ones speaking for him, and that for now, the important thing was they understood they weren't alone, that although Patrick had abandoned them without a shred of compassion, the mountain always received those who arrived with humility, and if they stayed a little longer, perhaps they would discover that what happened during the storm wasn't a punishment, but a beginning. Dorothy didn't answer, but kept silence, looking toward the altered terrain, as if her eyes tried to read a message she still couldn't decipher, though something inside her began to change. A faint, fragile sensation, not quite hope, but an opening to the possibility that maybe life hadn't brought them there solely to suffer. Dorothy spent a large part of the morning moving slowly through the raised hillside, trying to sort the remains of her short life in Stony Creek, and desperately calculating what she would do to survive now that the storm had taken not just her belongings, but also the few certainties she had brought with her. And while she checked stones, gathered scattered plastics, and evaluated how much mud remained firm under her feet, Nicholas, still recovering from the cold of the previous night, dedicated himself to exploring the nearby zone where the water had run with greater force, a wide space where the torrential current had left exposed layers of fine gravel shining with small reflections as the sun rose shyly among the clouds. And Dorothy thought maybe they could find something useful among the debris dragged by the wind, though inside she knew none of that would solve their real problem, because they needed food, shelter, and a plan. And at her age, she saw nothing but difficulties growing in front of them like impassable mountains. Nicholas walked hunched over, feeling the ground with his hands, and occasionally lifted some small pebble to observe it in the sun, until suddenly he said he had seen a weird shine, something that didn't look like mud or common rock. And Dorothy replied, saying not to get too distracted, that the storm could still have left dangerous corners, but Nicholas insisted, saying it was something he had never seen, and bent down to pick up various translucent fragments, looking like small pieces of ice that didn't melt despite the growing heat of the day, and returned toward his mother with closed fists, almost excited, saying she had to see what he found because it seemed to him those stones had something special, though he wouldn't know how to explain what. Dorothy, exhausted and with a stabbing pain in her back forcing her to stop every few steps, looked at the stones with a mix of disinterest and annoyance, and said they were surely old glass dragged by the storm, pieces of some broken bottle or some lost ornament the water had unearthed, and added that in that place there was nothing worthwhile, that Patrick always made sure to leave her only what no one wanted. But Nicholas replied, saying these weren't like common glass, and slid one of the pieces over his palm to show it better. And Dorothy observed the stone had an icy, almost metallic inner shine, capturing the light in a different way. Though even so, she said with a sigh, it could shine all it wanted, but remained just a useless stone. Walter, who for a while had been observing them in silence from a small mound, descended slowly with the help of his walking stick, and said he wanted to see what Nicholas was holding because the way the stone reflected the light had caught his attention. And when the old man took one of the fragments between his rough fingers, his expression changed immediately, and he stood looking at it with a mix of surprise and respect, as if holding something sacred in his hands, and said that stone wasn't glass, nor quartz or calcite, that it had a peculiar, slightly greasy texture to the touch, something found only in very specific materials the earth hid for hundreds of thousands of years. Dorothy, still incredulous, asked what that meant, but Walter didn't answer immediately, but asked for another stone, this time a bit larger and walked toward a granite rock nearby, exposed after the storm. Then he said that would be the moment for both to see with their own eyes what the stone Nicholas had found was made of, and pressed the translucent fragment against the granite surface and dragged it with force, generating a metallic screech, causing Dorothy and Nicholas to step back from the startle. And when Walter removed the stone, a perfectly marked line, deep and sharp, crossed the granite surface, while the small, transparent stone remained intact in his hand without any scratch. Nicholas's eyes went wide. "That's not possible. Glass can't scratch rock that hard." "Of course glass couldn't do it," Walter replied, his voice grave. "But that stone isn't glass." Can you imagine the shock? The very land Patrick called worthless is hiding a secret that could change everything for Dorothy and Nicholas. But finding a treasure like this in the middle of nowhere brings its own kind of danger, doesn't it? And added with a grave voice that what they had in front of them was a diamond in its rough state, one of the hardest materials in nature, one most people never get to see in its original form, because diamonds sold in jewelry stores are cut and polished, not ripped directly from the belly of the earth. Dorothy felt her legs weaken for an instant, as if the discovery had stirred something deep and unknown, but still said that must be a mistake, that it made no sense for there to be diamonds in such a miserable place, because if that were true, Patrick would never have given them that land. And Walter replied, saying Patrick knew nothing of geology, that the rancher only saw what he had in front of his eyes and had never stopped to understand the mountain, and precisely for that reason, Stony Creek had been despised for so long, because its surface showed nothing a man without knowledge could appreciate. Nicholas, heart racing, said if that was a diamond, then they could sell it and get out of the misery they were in. But Walter replied, saying they had to be very careful, that diamonds didn't just bring wealth, but also problems, and before any decision, they had to understand what type of terrain they had under their feet, because he suspected the storm hadn't just unearthed a few stones, but left exposed a much larger deposit. Without wasting time, Walter asked them to accompany him to an area of the hillside where the water had created a natural depression, and explained that in those places, when the mountain housed kimberlite, the mother rock of diamond, the heaviest material usually got trapped after heavy rains, along with characteristic minerals like reddish garnets and small fragments of green olivine, and pointed to several brightly colored stones confirming his theory, while Nicholas, increasingly amazed, helped remove gravel with his hands. And Dorothy, observing how under the wet mud small sparks of light appeared, felt something inside her beginning to wake up, as if the mountain, which the previous night seemed an enemy, was now trying to show itself as an involuntary ally. In less than an hour, they had gathered a small handful of diamonds of different sizes, some barely visible, others with a more respectable volume, among them one Walter held with both hands, saying that one could be worth more than Patrick's entire ranch. And Nicholas, with a mix of euphoria and fear, asked what they should do now, if they could sell them, if they should flee, if there was a law protecting their find. Dorothy, with the large diamond reflecting in her eyes, said the first thing was to talk to no one, that Patrick could never find out about this, that if he knew what that hillside hid, he would come with all his people to claim what didn't belong to him. And Walter nodded, saying the mountain had revealed its treasure, but that treasure had to be treated with intelligence, patience, and silence, because wealth like that could save them, but could also destroy them if they didn't act with caution. And so, with the sun finally breaking through the scattered clouds, Dorothy understood that that land wasn't a condemnation, but an unexpected revelation that would change her destiny forever. Dorothy spent a large part of the afternoon sitting on a flat rock, hands clasped on her lap, and gaze lost on the horizon where the mountain began to tinge with reddish tones from the sunset light. And while she observed that landscape that the day before had almost destroyed her, she thought about how ironic it turned out that it now hid the only real possibility of surviving. Because although they had in their possession a small pile of rough diamonds, stones whose value exceeded any figure she could imagine, the immediate reality was they had nothing to eat, no shelter, no money to buy tools or medicine, not even a dry blanket to cover themselves for the night. And that contradiction kept her trapped between desperation and a fearful hope she barely dared acknowledge. Nicholas, still excited by the discovery but conscious of the precariousness in which they lived, said they should sell one of the diamonds to be able to subsist a few days and perhaps travel to the county seat, where they could register the land or seek counsel before Patrick knew what was in Stony Creek, and added they should choose the smallest so as not to raise suspicions, because if someone saw a stone too big, word could spread and everything would be ruined. And Dorothy replied, saying he was right, that prudence was the only weapon they had against a powerful man like Patrick. And although the idea of parting with even a fragment of that newly discovered fortune produced a strange knot in her chest, she knew immediate survival was above any grandiose plan they could imagine. Walter, with his calm typical of one who has learned not to rush the earth, said selling just one was a smart move, but they should do it far from the town if possible, because people talked more than they listened, and rumors traveled faster than a man's steps. However, he also recognized Dorothy and Nicholas didn't have strength to walk beyond the town, and for now their only option was to sell it there, though he insisted they must do it with precaution and avoiding drawing attention. Dorothy took between her fingers the smallest stone of the group, a tiny drop of frozen light seeming insignificant next to the others, and said that would be the one she'd sell, and put it inside her blouse, close to her chest, with the sensation of hiding someone else's heart beating with a force she didn't fully understand. The next morning, body still aching and clothes stiffened by dry mud, Dorothy decided to go down to the town alone, because she said if Nicholas accompanied her, they would draw more attention, and also because she felt she had to assume responsibility for the first step on that uncertain path. And while descending the winding path, her broken boots sank into the wet mud remaining between rocks, and every step was a mix of fatigue, fear, and determination. Approaching the first houses of the town, she noticed the gazes following her from half-open windows and porches where some women pretended to sweep, and heard someone murmur Dorothy was unrecognizable, that Patrick had kicked her off the ranch, and now she lived like an animal on the mountain. And another commented it was a shame to see her like that after so many years of service, though saying it without coming out to offer help. Only with that morbid tone people usually use to comment on others' misfortunes. Dorothy kept her face forward and replied in silence, saying dignity didn't depend on the mud covering her boots, but on the capacity to keep walking, though inside she noticed every word she managed to hear burned like salt in an open wound. In the main square, the air smelled of fresh bread and coffee, and that aroma awoke in Dorothy a deep need for something hot. But she forced herself to ignore it, reminding herself she couldn't spend a coin until closing the deal for which she had come down. When she arrived at Gary's jewelry store, a narrow shop with dusty display cases and a wooden counter that needed repair years ago, she took a deep breath before entering and told herself she had to appear calm, secure, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. Gary, a heavy-set man with small eyes and a crooked smile, observed her from behind the counter and asked what she needed. If she came to pawn some old junk, because he only bought objects worth something real, and his tone was so condescending, Dorothy felt that humiliation was almost worse than those suffered at the ranch, but replied saying she didn't come to beg for charity, that she brought something he might want to buy, though she doubted he could afford it. And those words made Gary's smile freeze for a second, before saying to show what she had, that he would know how to value if it was really something of interest. Dorothy put her hand in her blouse and took out the tiny stone, holding it with the same delicacy a mother holds hope. And when she deposited it on the counter, Gary looked at it with disdain a few seconds before taking it with his chubby fingers, but his expression changed completely when the window light made the rock shine with an inner glow, and then said it was a simple river stone that didn't appear worth more than a broken bottle. But the way his eyes narrowed evidenced an anxious greed he tried to hide. Dorothy didn't blink. "You know perfectly well that stone isn't glass or trash, Gary. I didn't come down from the mountain for you to play me for a fool." She leaned in. "I need money, yes, but I won't be cheated." Gary cleared his throat, feigning annoyance. "Look, to stop wasting my time, I'll offer you $50 for a mediocre stone." Dorothy crossed her arms. "If you want to see me as a beggar, that's your problem. But I won't accept less than $500. I know what I'm holding." And added, if he didn't want to buy it, she'd look for someone who did know how to recognize a diamond when seeing it. Gary clenched his jaw, conscious he couldn't let her leave the store with that stone without risking another jeweler buying it, and after a brief silence said fine, $500 it would be, but she was getting more than it was worth, though both knew it was he gaining a fortune disguised as mercy. With the roll of bills in hand, Dorothy left the jewelry store feeling a mix of relief and vertigo and walked directly toward the market, where she bought fresh bread, cured cheese, 2 thick blankets, and sturdy boots to replace her destroyed shoes. And while paying for the purchases, her heart filled with a kind of timid, almost childlike joy, because for the first time in a long time she could hold something that wasn't misery or pain. And upon starting the way back toward the mountain, bags hanging from her arms and fresh wind caressing her face, she said to herself, Nicholas would be happy seeing her return with food and shelter. That small triumph would keep them standing to continue the plan they were barely starting to trace. But while she ascended the dirt path, without knowing that behind her the shadow of her good fortune was already being contaminated, Gary stayed inside the jewelry store, shaking the stone between his fingers, marveling at its purity, and picked up the phone with a malicious smile, saying he needed to talk to Patrick urgently because he had information that would interest him very much, and added the old woman from Stony Creek had come down covered in mud, bringing an authentic diamond, and that she had found one. Gary didn't just smile. He dialed with trembling fingers, waiting for the rancher to pick up. "Patrick, listen to me carefully," Gary hissed into the receiver, his eyes still glued to the diamond. "You know that old woman you threw out? The one you said was useless? She just walked in here with a rough diamond the size of a pigeon's egg. And it's pure, Patrick, flawless. If she found one on that hill, there are millions buried there." He paused, listening to Patrick's roar on the other end, and added with a serpentine whisper, "I bought it for peanuts, but the mine is still legally unclaimed if you act fast. She's walking back up there alone. You know what to do." Dorothy is walking back up that mountain feeling hopeful for the first time, completely unaware that a trap is snapping shut behind her. Greed moves fast in a small town, and things are about to get very dangerous for her and her son. Probably there were more hidden in that land he had gifted her, and while hanging up the phone, his smile extended like a dark crack presaging trouble, contrasting with the innocent joy of Dorothy, who, suspecting nothing, kept climbing the mountain with the illusion that finally a ray of hope illuminated her destiny. Dorothy returned to the hillside of Stony Creek with bags hanging from her arms, fresh wind pushing her gray hair back, and an emotion difficult to contain beating in her chest. And when at last she spotted Nicholas and Walter, sitting by the large rock, she felt an unexpected warmth in their tired gazes, as if her return meant more than the simple obtaining of food. And approaching, said she brought a banquet worthy of celebration, while dropping onto the stone a loaf of bread, still warm, and a generous piece of cured cheese giving off a strong, comforting aroma, making Nicholas say that smell returned a bit of life to him after so many deprivations. And Walter, with that toothless but sincere smile characterizing him, replied saying, "Even on the hardest mountain, a shared bread could be more valuable than a treasure." And Dorothy, laughing softly despite fatigue, took from her clothes the small roll of bills Gary had given her, and said she not only brought bread, but also the means to start the path to their future, and explained how she managed to sell the smallest diamond and wring 500 from the greedy jeweler. And Nicholas opened his eyes with disbelief, saying it was the first time in his life he saw so much money together, while Walter nodded slowly, saying that money would serve not only to survive a few days, but also to reach the county seat, where they could register the land and minerals they had found before Patrick found out and came to claim what didn't correspond to him. They ate, the 3 of them, as if it were the last meal in the world, tearing large pieces of bread, spreading cheese with clumsy but happy fingers. And Dorothy said that improvised banquet tasted better than any meal she had tasted at the ranch, because they had earned it with their hands, fighting against the mountain and the storm. And Nicholas replied saying Harold would be proud to see her like that, so firm, so determined. And for a moment, Dorothy felt her late husband was sitting there with them, in the form of the wind, in the sunset light, in the strength with which life seemed to push her forward despite all recent suffering. It was then when Walter, seeing both Dorothy and Nicholas were calmer, said the moment had arrived to explain something that could change their way of seeing Stony Creek forever. And with the patience of one who has lived decades listening to the earth's language, took a handful of wet gravel and said diamonds don't form near the surface, but at immense depths, where heat and pressure are so extreme they turn carbon into pure stone. and added, "They only rise to the surface when a kimberlite pipe transports them during an ancient eruption," and pointed to the hillside, saying that dense black rock surrounding them was precisely kimberlite, the fossil footprint of a geological process that had happened millions of years ago, and that meant Stony Creek wasn't a sterile plot, but a unique relic, a natural vein whose value was incalculable. Nicholas said he couldn't believe Patrick had lived his whole life walking on a fortune without realizing. And Walter replied, saying, "Wealth isn't given to the arrogant, nor to those looking at the earth as if it were trash. That the mountain was waiting for someone who truly needed it, and perhaps that's why it had waited until Dorothy, with her tired hands and resistant heart, set foot on it to reveal its secret." Dorothy listened enthralled, feeling every word of the old miner fit like puzzle pieces she didn't know she was assembling, and said if the mountain had decided to show itself, then it was her responsibility to honor that gift, and added she wouldn't allow Patrick, with his cruelty and ambition, to come snatch what life had finally granted them, and raised her gaze to the hillside, saying that land was no longer a condemnation, but Harold's legacy and Nicholas's future, and promised to defend it even if the mountain turned against them again. Walter, touched by the strength of her voice, said that was the oath the earth needed to hear, because the mountain always responded better to those working with respect and not greed. And Nicholas added he would do everything within his reach to protect that place, because it was the only thing they had, and because never again would he allow someone to treat them like human refuse. It was in that instant, when the air seemed charged with meaning, that Walter, with forehead wrinkled by sudden worry, narrowed his eyes, looking toward the path descending from the valley, and said something wasn't right, that there was a cloud of dust moving too fast to be the wind. And Dorothy, turning her head toward the horizon, saw a narrow column of dust growing as a dark figure approached on the road. And Nicholas, feeling his heart shrink, said maybe it was some farmer who had seen the storm's traces coming to help. But Walter replied, saying those weren't steps of a farmer or walker, but the advance of strong engines, and he could recognize by the rhythm and distance it was trucks climbing the path. And added there were three, two black and a larger one behind carrying a metallic shine on the grill, and only one man in town had black trucks and a large silver truck. Patrick, Nicholas paled, and said how was it possible he knew so fast about the diamonds? And Walter replied, saying, greed always finds ways, that maybe someone saw Dorothy enter the jewelry store, or maybe the owner himself spoke more than necessary, and added there was no time for suppositions because the threat was already approaching. With urgent voice, said they must hide the stones immediately, that the diamonds couldn't remain exposed if they wanted to keep their lives and their right over Stony Creek, and pointed to a cavity between rocks where they could hide them temporarily. And also said Nicholas had to hide, because if Patrick saw him, he could use him as emotional leverage to force Dorothy to hand over everything. And Dorothy replied, saying she wouldn't allow her son to risk himself. But Walter said that was precisely the war of the poor, the war where one fights without weapons, with cunning and silence, because the rich always attack first with force and then with papers. Dorothy felt the air become heavy around her, like the slight comfort of food and money transforming into fear, but still squeezed the bag where she kept the newly bought blankets and said she wouldn't back down, that if Patrick came ready to destroy them, he'd have to face a woman who no longer feared either the storm or death. Nicholas briefly hugged his mother before running toward the hiding place, Walter pointed out, and Dorothy, heart pounding like a war drum, felt the entire mountain hold its breath, while the cloud of dust came closer and closer, and the engines roared like another storm, a storm not made of water and wind, but of men and weapons climbing decided to claim what didn't belong to them. And at that moment, she knew the destiny they had tried to avoid was about to catch them, wrapping Stony Creek in a tense silence, announcing the inevitable clash of two worlds that should never have met. Dorothy watched Nicholas disappear among the high rocks, where Walter had signaled the hiding place, and while seeing her son's adult figure slide between the shadows the mountain offered as a last refuge, she felt the air become so dense it could almost be chewed. Because although she knew Nicholas was a grown man, seeing him hide as if he were a fugitive awoke in her a deep indignation burning in her chest like live coals, and still said she must remain there until everything passed, because she needed him safe and knew Patrick was capable of anything if he felt cornered. Walter remained at her side, leaning on his walking stick, with rigid countenance and eyes attentive like those of an old animal learned to anticipate violence before it arrives, and said the mountain was holding its breath just like them, because something terrible was about to unleash. It is terrifying to see how quickly a moment of triumph can turn into a nightmare. Patrick thinks he has won, but he is underestimating the power of the mountain and the resilience of the people he threw away. Don't go anywhere. Justice is closer than he thinks. Dorothy inhaled deep, trying to cling to the serenity remaining, while the black trucks approached, kicking up so much dust the hillside seemed wrapped in an earthen whirlwind, hiding the details of imminent danger. And when the engines finally turned off, the silence remaining was more terrifying than the noise, because it was the silence of the hunt, the silence of men coming not to talk, but to impose. Patrick descended from the vehicle, with fury palpable in every movement, as if the earth itself trembled under his polished boots, and his gaze nailed onto Dorothy with an intensity that would have knocked her down if she hadn't accumulated so many decades of resisting humiliations in silence, and said he expected to find her here, that he had received very interesting news about her activities in Stony Creek, that it seemed the poor widow had found a new way to steal from him and the ranch, because according to what he had been informed, she was trading precious stones that didn't belong to her. Dorothy, with serene face but an internal tremor crossing her like an icy current, replied saying she hadn't stolen anything, that terrain had been a gift of his, refused disguised as charity, and everything found in that soil belonged to her because the law established it so. Patrick advanced with large steps toward the zone where the storm had ripped the surface layer off the terrain and crouched clumsily, sinking fingers into the wet mud, removing stones and rock fragments, until he lifted a piece of kimberlite still shiny from moisture, and his eyes opened with a mix of disbelief and rage. A rage so deep it made his voice come out almost in a growl when he said she had no idea what was in that land. That rock was worth more than everything he had given his workers in life, and it was evident the very cunning woman had known from the start it was a diamond mine. Dorothy felt an impulse to reply, saying she just discovered it thanks to the storm and Walter's knowledge, but understood immediately that would only worsen the situation, because Patrick's face began to transform, turning redder, more twitched, as if the certainty of having gifted something so valuable was consuming him. The thugs who had gotten out of the trucks began dispersing through the hillside, checking every corner, lifting stones, kicking gravel mounds, while Patrick approached Dorothy with slow, calculated steps and said she had no right to be there, that the mining concession still belonged to the ranch, that he had been generous, allowing her to occupy useless land, but if that land contained diamonds, then his generosity had ended, and now she must hand over immediately every stone she had found, because otherwise he would make her bear accusations grave enough for her to spend her last years locked up, and saying it, pushed her slightly with a finger on the shoulder, a small gesture but full of contempt. Walter, seeing the aggression, took a step front and said Patrick had no right to touch a woman who had lost everything just days ago, and added the storm had opened the truth of the earth, and that truth no longer belonged to him, but to those who had been thrown there as punishment. But before he could say anything more, Patrick pushed him with violence, making him fall to his knees, and Dorothy, driven by a mix of indignation and fear for the old man, launched forward to help him. But Patrick raised his hand and fired at the ground. So close to her feet, the explosion of dust and rock hit Dorothy's legs like a brutal slap, forcing her to step back, staggering for an instant, appearing eternal. The echo of the shot remained suspended in the air like petrified thunder, and Dorothy felt her heart beating her chest with such force she thought it would break. While Patrick, weapon still smoking, said he wouldn't allow any insubordination, that if she didn't cooperate, he himself would go look for the son she had hidden somewhere nearby, and he knew she was hiding him, because the mountain wasn't big enough to hide secrets from a determined man's eyes, and added in less than 2 minutes, his men could find him among the rocks. Dorothy felt deep vertigo, a mix of horror and desperation, imagining Nicholas being dragged by those brutal men, and understood immediately she couldn't risk her son being captured, because although he was adult and strong, she knew Patrick would use any means to break her, and violence against Nicholas would be his most effective weapon. It was then Dorothy slowly brought her hand to her chest, feeling the rough fabric of the blouse against skin and the slight lump of the handkerchief where she kept the 11 diamonds they hadn't sold, and her fingers trembled, touching the edge of the knot, because she knew handing over those stones meant renouncing, at least for the moment, the only ray of hope found amidst her misery, but also knew keeping them hidden meant endangering Nicholas, still crouched in some corner of the mountain trusting her. Time seemed to stop while Dorothy untied the knot clumsily and took out the handkerchief, feeling her soul tearing in silence, and looked up to see Patrick's face observing with a mix of triumph and greed. With trembling hands, she opened the handkerchief, revealing the icy stones shining even under the shadow projected by the dust clouds suspended in the air, and said there they were. That was all they had. There would be no more. And extended the handkerchief toward Patrick, who snatched it with almost anxious speed, like a thirsty man receiving water after an unending desert. Patrick examined the diamonds with voracious eyes, as if wanting to swallow them right there, and said he knew he'd find something like this, that the poor widow couldn't have such luck to discover a mine without him knowing, and added Stony Creek remained officially confiscated. He would recover the land and expel Dorothy and Nicholas immediately, because no one with a sound mind would allow two intruders to keep such a fortune. He turned to his men and ordered them to check the whole zone to ensure there were no more hidden stones. And Dorothy felt a pang in her chest, seeing how the hope flourishing over the last 24 hours crumbled like a sandcastle hit by a violent wave. However, even in that moment of defeat, she noticed the sky began to cloud over again behind the vehicles, and the wind dragged the dust disturbingly, as if the mountain hadn't said its last word. Patrick got into his truck with handkerchief in hand, smiling as if already owner of the world, imagining this would be just the start of the hell he himself was about to unleash. Dorothy remained paralyzed in the middle of the devastated hillside with trembling legs and the noise of the shot still bouncing in her chest like an unending echo, while the dust raised by the black trucks dispersed slowly, leaving behind a smell of gunpowder and fear mixing with the earthy dampness of Stony Creek. And in that instant, Walter, still on the ground after Patrick's brutal shove, began sitting up with effort, leaning first on an elbow, then his walking stick, and finally standing with the stubborn dignity of one surviving too many storms to let himself be beaten by one more blow. Although Dorothy could see blood slipping down his temple staining the white beard, a red thread far from weakening him seemed inflamed by ancient force keeping him standing. Walter took a deep breath, as if gathering courage from the mountain air itself, and said Patrick had committed a mistake so big not even his power could cover it, because there existed in law a figure he knew for years. The mining claim, a procedure allowing any mineral discovery made by civilians to be registered with the authorities, and explained he himself had visited the county recorder months ago, asking about the legality of certain rocks seen in other zones of the mountain, and the man told him if he ever found real evidence of kimberlite accompanied by heavy materials, he should file a document stating the exact location of the find, since the state could intervene, analyze, and if confirming a deposit's existence, the discoverer had legal rights. Dorothy felt something cold cross her back, a mix of surprise and hope, while Walter explained that he had prepared a sealed mining claim days ago to protect whoever discovered something valuable in Stony Creek. He suspected the mountain hid more than it showed. He added that he had already mailed the letter to the BLM office the moment the storm began, anticipating that the heavy rains might finally expose the Earth's secrets. Dorothy looked at him with disbelief and said she didn't understand why he hadn't told them before. And Walter replied, saying, "The mountain reveals its secrets when it wants, not when one demands them." And he had waited for the moment truth came to light, a moment unfortunately arriving, accompanied by violence and greed. Before Dorothy could reply, a sharp sound began filling the air, at first distant and distorted, as if coming from some remote corner of the mountain, but little by little becoming sharper, more urgent, and when she turned her head toward the path, saw intermittent blue and red lights illuminating the dust in fragmented swirls, approaching rapidly, and surprise left her speechless. Because it wasn't the local sheriff deputies Patrick controlled easily, but state troopers, more robust vehicles, and uniformed men whose dark color contrasted with the ochre earth. Walter lowered his walking stick, his expression grim. "I didn't send a letter, Patrick. I used my shortwave radio this morning. I contacted the State Mining Bureau and the state police the moment Nicholas found those stones. I told them a significant kimberlite deposit had been exposed and that I feared for the safety of the discoverers given the local landowner's reputation." Patrick turned sharply, hearing the sirens, and Dorothy saw his skin tense, his jaw close with an almost audible click, and eyes transform into two embers of desperation, because he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, he was facing something he couldn't control. A greater force not responding to bribes or favors, and wouldn't stop before threats. Patrick stepped back one step, then advanced two with clumsy, impulsive movement, and shouted that land was his. He had worked his whole life maintaining the ranch, and no one, not the state, nor an insolent old woman like Dorothy, nor a crazy man like Walter, would strip him of what belonged to him, and while shouting, put his hand in the pocket, keeping the stolen diamonds, squeezing them like talismans capable of returning the power lost in minutes. But what the hand found seeking comfort wasn't strength, but one more spark of madness. The metal of the weapon shone again when he raised it, this time without trembling, aiming directly at the old miner. And Dorothy felt the world stop. Wind stopped blowing, mountain entire hold breath. Walter didn't step back. Lifted head with calm only men possessing peace with destiny possess, long before death seeks them. That land never belonged to you, Patrick, Walter said calmly. You were only the steward of a fortune you were too blind to see. Patrick's face twisted in rage. He raised the weapon, aiming directly at the old man's chest. "Walter!" Dorothy screamed, launching herself in front of him with a speed defying her age, shielding her friend with her own body. Patrick's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, aiming directly at the old man's heart. Dorothy screamed, throwing herself in front of Walter, closing her eyes and bracing for the impact of death. Crack! The sound was deafening, but it wasn't the handgun that fired. A high-velocity round from the ridge struck Patrick's weapon with surgical precision, blasting the steel from his grip in a shower of sparks. Patrick howled in pain, clutching his numbed hand as the gun spun through the air and landed harmlessly in the dust. Before anyone could process the miracle, a voice amplified by a megaphone boomed from the rocks above, shaking the very ground. "State police, drop to your knees, right now!" The voice rumbled on the hillside, like a divine mandate, like the final sentence ending the empire of terror Patrick had built for decades. The thugs looked at each other, and Dorothy saw fear contorting their faces. Real fear, not the type they were used to sowing, but fear born when power changes hands and one discovers oneself small, insignificant, vulnerable. One of them dropped the weapon first, then the other imitated him, and rifles resonated, hitting stones. Patrick, in exchange, remained immobile, weapon still in hand, breathing like a cornered animal, while officers descended from patrol cars with calculated movements, surrounding him all sides, aiming with surgical precision. A sniper came down the hillside, rifle still smoking, confirming he diverted the shot by direct orders of the captain, who now approached Patrick with a look admitting no negotiation. Even on his knees, Patrick tried to play the victim. "You're making a mistake, Captain," he spat, sweat mixing with the dust on his face. "These two are trespassers. Thieves. I caught them stealing minerals from my ranch. I was defending my property." The captain looked down at him, unimpressed. But it was Walter who delivered the final blow. Limping forward, Walter pulled a folded, stamped document from his inner pocket, the mining claim he had secretly mailed. "A thief steals in the dark, Patrick," Walter said, his voice steady. "But a rightful owner registers with the state. This document proves that Stony Creek was claimed by Dorothy Miller 3 days ago, the moment the storm unearthed the first stone. And since you signed the eviction notice giving her the land in perpetuity, everything in that soil is hers." The captain took the document, reviewed the official timestamp, and looked back at Patrick with a cold smirk. "Looks like you just attempted to rob a registered diamond mine owner, Mr. Patrick, and used a deadly weapon to do it. That's a life sentence right there." There is something truly satisfying about watching a bully finally face the consequences of his own greed. Patrick thought his money placed him above the law, but he just learned a very hard lesson. Let's see how Dorothy rebuilds her life now that the storm has finally passed. Dorothy, still trembling, approached with caution and said Patrick threatened her and Walter, fired at ground to intimidate them, and intended to steal stones they found legitimately after storm. And Walter, leaning on walking stick, but with firm voice, replied saying he witnessed everything, and furthermore, existed previous document, the mining claim filed with the county, demonstrating intention to register minerals and work with law, not outside it, And also, Dorothy was legitimate owner of parcel, because Patrick had given it in writing, though now tried to disown it. The captain listened in silence, checking objects one by one, and seeing Patrick's disjointed expression, understood the rancher not only lost control, but was conscious of magnitude of what just revealed, and said investigation would follow all legal steps without exception, because no one was above law, not even man with land and money. Agents began checking Patrick's pockets, and found more loose diamonds, some covered in mud, others still with sharp edges where gravel rasped surface, and one officer said that quantity of material required immediate registration with State Mining Bureau, only meaning Stony Creek deposits were real and potentially extensive. Dorothy felt chill hearing words, because inside knew that land, same one receiving her with storm and misery, was about to become center of dispute, capable of elevating or destroying her. And still, said had no intention hiding anything, always wanted work with law, didn't seek fortune by greed, but survive with dignity. And Walter added, saying Mountain hadn't shown secret to be stolen with violence, but to be cared for, so those despised found home there. The captain nodded slowly like one recognizing simple but deep truth, and said decision didn't correspond to him, but to State Mining Registry. But meanwhile property must remain under legal custody and no one, save Dorothy and son, could remain there because so established transfer document Patrick signed voluntarily. Validity of that document reviewed immediately by agents, finding in it not only Patrick's signature, but also that of ranch secretary, converting it to duly ratified legal act. And Dorothy observed captain pointing that point with finger, saying, signed transfer meant parcel no longer belonged to ranch. Patrick renounced rights over it, and therefore any attempt to recover land via threats or force constituted grave crime. Walter intervened, saying mining claim was final puzzle piece, showing discovery notified before conflict and state would have to evaluate deposit, determining if strategic deposit, potentially making Dorothy and Nicholas legal partners of project with rights and state protection. Dorothy, hearing all that, felt knees weaken, not fear, but because justice, always seeming so distant, reserved for others, was finally inclining toward her, and breathed deeply, saying, only wanted live in peace. Late husband Harold worked whole life so they didn't die of hunger, and never imagined inheritance would be hillside full of shiny stones and hidden pains. The captain replied, saying, sometimes justice arrived late, but arrived and Mountain, like law, always found way to reveal truth. Patrick, hearing words, suffered visible transformation, as if whole power structure sustained for decades collapsed on him at once, and began shouting everything was his, no one had right to take what belonged to him. He raised ranch with own hands, family always owned lands, but words sounded hollow, desperate, no real force, because agents found in pockets proof of crime, and weapon fired at ground sufficient to accuse of attempted homicide or at least aggravated assault. Dorothy observed how town neighbors, beginning to approach from lower path, looked at Patrick not with fear, but something like contempt or liberation, because for years lived under shadow, accepting dominion, fear, or need, and now saw man cornered, handcuffed, dirty with mud, and face deformed by frustration. Walter said, curse Patrick, always attributed to land wasn't in Stony Creek, but in himself, in incapacity to see value of things beyond own ego. And Captain replied, saying, justice would seek repair damages, not perpetuate guilts. When finally agents loaded Patrick into state truck, Dorothy felt huge weight detach from back, as if rancher's shadow dissolved in air, and silence following had something sacred, as if Mountain approved outcome. Nicholas came out then from hiding, running toward mother with contained tears, and said heard everything from rocks, feared for her hearing shot, believed life taking everything again, but seeing Patrick detained seemed kind of divine justice. Justice Harold would have thanked from wherever he was. Dorothy hugged him strongly, letting repressed crying days run finally free down face, saying survived, storm didn't destroy them, mountain didn't reject them, world for once decided be on their side. Days following marked by arrival of state officials, geologists, engineers, and mining registry representatives, confirming Stony Creek hillside housed authentic kimberlite pipe and law-recognized right of Dorothy and Nicholas not only remain on land, but participate future project as founding partners. Walter, converted into spontaneous advisor of process. Said Mountain chose well. Harold would be proud seeing family rise on stones. He himself walked whole life without recognizing value. Every morning, Dorothy walks this land. There is a strange, beautiful peace in her heart. Now the fear is gone, replaced only by a profound sense of gratitude. But the most beautiful part is that Dorothy and Nicholas didn't keep that heaven-sent fortune for themselves. Right on the very spot where they once huddled under a torn tarp, helpless against the raging storm, they built the Harold Shelter. It became a warm home for the elderly, who had been cast aside and forgotten by society, just as she and her son once were. Those cold diamonds from the barren earth have now been transformed into hot soup, soft beds, and most importantly, dignity for hundreds of forgotten souls. Dorothy often points to the hillside, now lush and green, and whispers to the newcomers, "Sometimes God has to break our hearts to save our souls, and he has to crack the dry earth open to reveal the treasure hidden beneath." The blessing she prayed for didn't arrive wrapped in a pretty bow. It came disguised as a storm, as mud, and as the harshest struggles of her twilight years. Watching her son Nicholas busy himself with the new building, Dorothy smiles. Life has taught her a profound lesson. The true treasure was never those sparkling stones. The real treasure was the faith that kept them standing when everything else crumbled. It was the inner strength that rose up when they had nothing left. And it was the unshakable belief that even the most devastating storm is just a way to clear the path for a better future. The wind still blows gently over Stony Creek, but it is no longer a dead land. It is a legacy of love, a living proof that justice might arrive late, but it will arrive to illuminate even the darkest places. The story of Dorothy, Nicholas, and Walter comes to a close, but it leaves us with a message. Never surrender to fate. Even in the worst adversity, a seed of hope is always waiting to grow, as long as you keep the faith. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of today's story brought tears to your eyes? Was it the resilience of a 1-year-old woman, the price the greedy Patrick had to pay, or the moment the truth was revealed beneath the mud? Pour your heart out in the comments below. I read every single one of your shares. And if this story warmed your heart, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell right next to it. Because right now, appearing on your screen, is another equally touching story about karma that you definitely don't want to miss. Thank you for listening and for being part of our family. I'll see you in the next video.